Ali asked me to give a talk, I decided to give a summary of what we did in the last 10 years. Well, almost 10 years because I started in 2016. And I was excited to put that in the title of the presentation, but soon I realized that I cannot squeeze everything and present it, everything that we did. And not because I'm a hard worker, but because I was very fortunate to have good, hardworking, and productive graduate students. So I decided to put a slide. The first slide that I have is to just tell you what we did briefly, and then I talk about a few studies. So here we have Zara. Zara is now a postdoc at CU Boulder. Jean-Claude, data scientist slash a research associate at UCLA, and Anish, who is was assistant professor at Montana State University, working on precision agriculture. So they're discussing plants, I guess, and uh, posing for this. And one of the plots that we have a ground cover irrigation trial. So let's see if we can advance the slides. When I started, my background and training is biosystems slash irrigation engineering. So I had no prior experience doing landscape irrigation. I was involved and led multiple irrigation projects in graduate school and also as a faculty, all related to agriculture. But then my work was on urban water management and landscape, at least in part. So I started doing landscape irrigation when I started at UCR. And over the years, we had research plots at Kearney Rec, South Coast Rec in Irvine, and then UC Riverside, but it shrinked. And now we have mainly plots in UC Riverside. So at some point, I think 400, 500 fully autonomous research plots. That's what we had. And the main thing that I learned after 10 years is that there are lots of questions to answer when we think about landscape irrigation and little funding. So just a fraction, 10% or 20% of the money that we bring is landscape and urban water. The remaining is agriculture. So that has been the most challenge. But in terms of what we did, the main question or the main thing that drives us is to understand the soil water plant atmosphere relationship. And first and foremost, we are working on irrigation and water conservation. So you will see that we deviated over the years from that core question of water conservation or how to save water through proper or efficient irrigation management. But even when we try to entertain questions that are related to plant species or urban cooling, the design of the experiments and the main question still is irrigation. So keep that in mind. So if you are to do I guess, urban cooling research and the irrigation is not the central focus, then the design and data collection protocols would be different. So when I started, the first thing that I did as an engineer, of course, I wanted to use the emerging technologies to see how they can help to advance irrigation management. And the term that I've been using is autonomous irrigation management. And I'm mainly talking about using smart controllers. So most of the work on a smart controller application and evaluation is coming from humid regions, mainly in Florida. So they did a ton of work on using ET-based and soil moisture sensor-based controllers. But it's just for obvious reasons, the climate differences and rainfall patterns, what they do and learn is not going to be directly applicable in Southern California, which is mainly arid and semi-arid, with little to no rain during summer that we have peak ET demand. So we started doing, so what I put in parentheses, I guess it's the main contribution of my team. Application of soil moisture sensor-based and ET-based irrigation controllers. We did a lot of work on evaluating these products, and very soon we realized or decided that the product that we are going to promote is mainly ET-based controllers. I think those are better for our region, and it's the opposite of what you see in, let's say, Florida. They get a lot of rain, and soil moisture sensor bears are better because they just sense how much water is in the soil profile and prevent excessive irrigation. For us, it's more important if we want to do irrigation management for different plant species and drought-tolerant species is to do it. It's easier to do it with ET-based controllers, in my opinion. Then first we had turf grass plots. Soon we saw demand in alternative species, ground covers, native and non-native. So we did a lot of work with Don, who is here, Don Merhat, my great colleague and friend, on drought and heat-tolerant plant selection. I'm going to share some of that result with you as well today. And the main contribution has been, and I'm talking about applied research mainly here, is just developing landscape coefficient information, or plant factor, as plant people call it. What fraction of reference ET should be applied for irrigation scheduling? Then, as we collected data and moved through different plants and did a few of these trials, we realized that there are consequences. You stress the plants, they're going to respond, and that might impact their ecosystem benefits. So that then we became gradually interested, and Don became more involved in understanding the plant behavior and drought-tolerant plants. I call them drought-tolerant, but Don a couple of times mentioned to me that some of them endure drought, some of them escape drought. So there are different mechanisms and behaviors. So if you look at the literature in terms of irrigation management of landscape, usually people look at aesthetic values. You stress plants, they're going to look bad. So there is a threshold, typically based on visual ratings. And you don't want to get there. That's basically when you stop and say, this is the minimum irrigation application. It's subjective. It's not as straightforward as looking at yield, which we do in agriculture, food production and crop production areas. So what we did, another contribution of my team, is that we said, okay, so we do this visual rating, but we want to switch to remote sensing that is more objective, if you will. And we picked NDVI as a proxy that people usually understand. Greater NDVI is usually associated with plants that are stress-free and greener and healthier. And there has been studies a lot on mainly turf grass, NDVI and visual quality rating. Of course, we learned from them, but the work that we did on NDVI threshold establishing for ground covers, I think that's something that I haven't seen many studies like that in the literature. So, but in terms of the consequences, we went beyond aesthetic values. So we kept that still as the main focus when we talk about irrigation, that we want plants to look healthy and good. But then we were monitoring plant temperature mainly as one of the parameters that you can use to, let's say, develop crop water stress index for irrigation scheduling, or just generally to see if plants transpiring and they are under stress or not. Soon we realized that we can actually tie that back to what I called evaporative cooling or potential evaporative cooling. And I'm going to show you why I believe that canopy temperature can be a good proxy. And when we talk about cooling, I should make it clear that, of course, shade is the most important, I think, mechanism, but then it's usually local when you think about it. And then we have albedo, how much of the sun is reflected back by the canopy, and then evaporative cooling, which is how much of the incoming energy goes towards latent heat flux as opposed to sensible heat flux. So that's the main part that we focus, but we started doing some albedo work. We haven't done serious work on shade. We did some carbon dynamics as well. So if we want to think about carbon sequestration and emission, how does irrigation, again, from the irrigation management perspective, impact that? Some work on salinity, some work on environmental justice. So if you zoom out from our small scale plots, how does water conservation impact different neighborhoods with socioeconomic backgrounds? So what we did mainly has been, in terms of data collection, systematically documenting canopy temperature under multiple irrigation scenarios. And we did it for a number of species over a couple of years. So we have, I think, a good data set. One thing that I think we can do with our current data, because we usually have areas of soil moisture at different depths, and we continuously collect data from from our plot. So now we have lots of data that we haven't really looked into them in terms of infiltration rate. I think there should be a difference. The hypothesis is that not to think about it as a retention pond, but just one mechanism for us in Southern California is to capture as much rainfall as we can. Is there any difference when we switch plant materials or based on the history of irrigation management if plants have been under stress or stress-free in terms of how much rainfall they can capture and then how much stormwater is there? This is something that I think we can do with the soil moisture data that we have. We started doing some landscape mulching, so mainly because people talk about now turf grass replacement, non-functional turf removal, and then usually after that there is some new plants that is and mulching is part of it or just mulch. In terms of cooling or temperature, weed management, and what's happening in the soil profile, soil temperature. So if I get a chance, I'll talk about this is ongoing. And we use statistical modeling and remote sensing a lot. So I have a few slides to show you how we use remote sensing. I think remote sensing is very important for water management in general, but also in urban areas when you want to do proper water management for larger areas like golf courses or urban parks or publicly maintained areas that HOAs, for example, maintain just to see drought injury or even irrigation systems that are broken. So for practical standpoints, and also you can answer very interesting questions with advanced cameras. So what we learned from our turfgrass trials, initial trials that we did in Southern California and also Central California, a few things that I'm just listed a few things that are a little bit maybe controversial. So we didn't see the water conservation potential of turfgrass species that usually you see in literature that comes from turfgrass scientists. We just didn't see it. I don't know if we did a terrible job managing irrigation or it's just not there. I have a few hypotheses or a few things that I think contributed to these differences. For example, we didn't see that those nominal values, 60% ETO for warm season graph, 80% for cool season. What we saw was more like 80% for warm season, 100% for cool season. You go below that after a couple of months in inland Southern California or even in Central California, you see drought injury. So I think there are two things that at least I identified that might explain why the results in the literature are more promising sometimes than they should be, perhaps. One is that some of the studies are in greenhouse. So in greenhouse, there is no runoff, no deep percolation. So you babysit the plants. That's just not the reality. I mean, we did everything that you should do in terms of proper irrigation management that soak and cycle irrigation or irrigating overnight, doing it based on proper irrigation scheduling. We minimized it, but you still have all of those evaporative loss, wind drift. So that's in part, I think, the difference between the irrigation that you plant use in terms of or against or what you apply. So I think in reality you will have some water loss, and we report that. We don't report about how much water crop use. We report how much water we apply. Another thing is that we always have calibrated flow meters in our plots. Some of the studies that I see, they just rely on catch can test. They say, okay, we put some catch cans that tells us how much water our system applies. We did some systematic tests. We have a paper in review. Catch can test can be unreliable if you and should not be used, in my opinion, to calculate irrigation application rate. It should be calibrated flow meter. So in our test, at least, catch can test always underestimates how much water you apply. So you think you're applying, let's say, 80% ETO, but in reality, you're applying 100%. Another maybe controversial finding that we look at it over and over again is the whole concept of should we limit irrigation in terms of watering days, which is what municipalities do it. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it because maybe people save more water if they are forced to apply only 1 or 2 days a week. But when we do it properly using smart controllers, on demand always works better. And on demand is that you just let the controller choose how many days to irrigate based on if it's an ET-based controller based on atmospheric evaporative demand, or if it's soil moisture controller, it's going to look at soil moisture. And the answer, I think what is happening is clear, makes sense, it's common sense. If evaporative demand is higher, then controller irrigates more frequently. It's lower, cloudy days, cooler days, it's irrigate. But if you don't have that, you just fix the watering days and you have a high evaporative demand, then you're dumping a lot of water and there will be water loss. We looked at the performance of the controllers. For us to apply minimum irrigation, ET-based controllers, just the one that we tested, I should be clear, because there are a lot of brands that are called smart. I haven't tested all of them. We haven't tested them. I don't know how smart they are. But the controller that we tested from Weathermatic uses Hargreaves and Samani equation. It's a well-known simplified equation for ET estimation. It worked well. And then also we developed an AI model that pulled all the CIMS data from all the CIMS stations, and we have it actually on my website. If you are interested, you can see it. It's AI model, more sophisticated techniques that outperform Hargreaves, not by a great deal, but 13% on average. As soil moisture-based controllers, what we observed is that some inconsistency in terms of how much water they apply. Maybe that's the way they should be. But when you look at the water applied by a smart soil moisture-based controllers against ET demand, it just fluctuates. Sometimes they apply 70% ET, sometimes 50%, sometimes 30%. And that's a good point to talk about. I worked at one of my students that was not in that picture, Amninder, who is a data scientist at Bayer, did at South Coast Rec. I noticed also that I put research and extension in the title. I just don't have time to go over the extension work that we do, but all of these projects have an extension component. It's integrated. We do a lot of presentations and working with industry and everything. So this is recycled water irrigation, again, from the autonomous irrigation standpoint. And we use the soil moisture sensor-based irrigation controller, lots of settings in terms of upper threshold and lower threshold. 50, for example, this one is 55% of field capacity as lower thresholds, 100% field capacity as upper thresholds. What we realized is that year after year after year, there was a reduction in NDVI as the main proxy for quality. And I think it's attributed, at least in part, to salt accumulation. What we did, we didn't apply extra water to leach the salt down. We were relying on natural rainfall. And you can see here that spring 2019, salt around 1 decisiemens per meter. After deficit irrigation and summertime, salt accumulation. You get some rain, you wash the salt down. Again, you apply deficit irrigation second year. Higher salinity level reaches 2 to 4 decisiemens. You get some rain, get to a spring. This is warm season, by the way, so it goes dormant over the winter. Still some leaching, but then salt is much greater than when we started in the spring 2019. I guess the take-home message was that, and that's something that some people that use recycled water in Irvine are vocal about the negative impacts, and this is what we saw. At least with the smart controllers, you should apply a little bit of water to leach the salt. If you don't do it, it's gonna cause some problems. So very soon, again, we started looking at different plant materials. And the main question that I had at least, I'm still interested in learning from Don, and is that why drought-tolerant species behave differently? And it's from the irrigation standpoint and water management standpoint. And we mainly focus and zoom in how they access water, how much water they access, and how they use that water. So it's just a story of water that is happening in the soil. So I have this little drawing that I did for an NSF proposal that was not funded. I said, well, I can still use it here. So you can see that the plant that maybe has shallower roots, they cannot access deep water. And then if they have deeper roots, then they can access deep soil moisture. That's one mechanism. What is the root system, the extent, how much water they uptake? And you can entertain other ideas. For example, the concept of hydraulic redistribution or compensated root water uptake, which is basically if part of the root is dry, another part is wet, deeper layer is, for example, wet. If they can reach it, they can still uptake more water, compensate for that part that is dry. Moving up, then of course there is leaf area index. How much leaf is there? What is that dictates transpiration rate, and if they drop their leaves or they slow down vegetation. Moving still up to talking about leaves, stomatal regulation, of course, the degree of isohydricity that have isohydric or anisohydric behavior. We were interested in that. And then also albedo. Do plants have different albedos? When we stress them, that albedo changes. How does that play in the whole energy and water balance approach? And remember, I told you that we look at canopy temperature and irrigation-induced cooling. So this is a graph that I usually use in my hydrology class to tell the students how energy partitions or what are the energy fluxes when you think about irrigated um, plants. This is for bare soil, but still the soil was wet in day one, dry day two. And you can see that the incoming energy, the solid black line curves are almost the same. What happens is that day one to day two, the soil gets dry, but the energy flux towards ground doesn't change much, this light gray. You just see that these two alter. So the energy that goes towards evaporation in this case, and for when plants are there, goes towards evapotranspiration, the latent heat flux goes down, that blue line, and the sensible heat flux or the air that contributes to air temperature goes up. So that's the main mechanism that I think is happening and may, if you have look at it at large scale, of course, contributes to cooling in urban areas. Then we stress plants, we practice deficit irrigation, limited irrigation, transpiration goes down, and then that reduces the latent heat flux. And of course, when I tell my students, I shouldn't tell it here, but just I tell them if you have a plant in your front yard, you irrigate it, over irrigated, whatever you do, that's not going to bring the temperature down. So there should be a big enough fetch. This is more like neighborhood scale. If you have a neighborhood that has lots of trees, or maybe even city scale, so that, or a backyard that is fully uh, under full irrigation, then you see some cooling overnight, perhaps. So some of the data that we got, usually this is a typical data set that we collect. We monitor NDVI and canopy temperature. These are some plants. This is Anish, published 2 papers in Hort Science with Don Merhat. Our first ground cover study. You see that NDVI fluctuates over time. We monitor it every week or every other week. And these are under different irrigation treatments, going from 80% ETO to 20% ETO. And the fact that these points are not at the same level, it tells me that this is second year of data. So some plants, although we switched to full irrigation, didn't recover from last year's deficit irrigation. But some that did, for example, lantana, you can see that you stress it, the NDVI drops. But some species, and these are species that we are very interested in, intrigued by their behavior. For example, this Rhagodia or creeping Australian saltbush kept the NDVI high even under 20% ETO, and also canopy cool. You see the temperature. This is just a snapshot, but we have the temperature for the entire summer, 5, 6 months, even more than summer that we collect, monitor temperature. They just behave differently. And Zara later on, she did a lot of work on root zone, water uptake patterns and modeling, but she also monitored plant performance, just typical data sets that we collect. You can see again NDVI, and for some of these plants, and most of these are at least promoted as drought tolerant species, but you see that their response to deficit irrigation and the canopy temperature values are drastically different. So what Zara did, and I'm going to show you if I get a chance, how she did it. So with numerical modeling, so she realized that, or she showed that for this Procida acacia, that if I'm not mistaken, this is also a plant from Australia. There are 2 mechanisms: extensive root system and anisohydric behavior. So risk-taking plants that keep their stomata open even when they are under stress and there is limited water. That contributes to cooling canopy and then maintained high NDVI values. So those are the plants that, in my opinion, when you think about cool canopy and irrigation, we need those plants that they do well under limited irrigation, keep their canopy cool, and then also aesthetic values are above the minimum threshold. And this is same the study that actually Anish started. He was very interested in what's happening in terms of physiological properties of the plants. So he monitored leaf area index, stomatal conductance, canopy temperature, and NDVI. This is just all the data aggregated. So I'm not talking about differences between plant species, but this is what you expect to happen. You cut the water back, NDVI goes down, so at some point visual quality is not acceptable anymore. Temperature goes up if you cut the irrigation back. And what he showed overall, at least for all the plants, the leaf area index goes down. So either they drop their leaves or slow down vegetation. And then stomatal conductance also goes down. So they are not really risk-taking, showing risk-taking behavior. We don't see it overall. Some species are that like that, but not most. So there is a reduction in transpiration rate. Oh, Don, you're here too. So, but what is the most important thing that Anish did was documenting again delta T, canopy minus air temperature for these against applied irrigation. And you can see that these plants are just very different. This green one, the plant that kept the canopy cool even under very low irrigation application, was actually a plant from Australia as well. So they don't pay me, believe me, because I've said this over and over in my talks that we shouldn't really push really for native species. In my opinion, if the goal is to conserve water, we just need to look at the data. What plants work well, maybe some plant species from Australia work better than our native species. Some native species that we had, they just didn't like water. They looked ugly, and for over application of water, that might happen if you have a broken valve or pipe or something, and they went dormant. So that's something to, I guess, consider. And back to Zara's work, that she was very interested in what's happening in the root zone. She did a lot of root measurement in the lab, and then also she was interested in modeling. So she said, okay, I'm gonna pick a process-based model, hydrous in this case. And this study just was published last week. Her second paper on irrigation is accepted in minor revision. This one is on numerical modeling of root water uptake. So the first thing that she did said, okay, should I optimize root water uptake parameters by itself and then optimize, sorry, soil hydraulic properties and then root water uptake, or optimize everything together? Everything together work better. And then the second one that is a collaborative work with a researcher in Italy. We haven't published this yet. She looked at other models more sophisticated than FEDES model, that is an older model. So some of these models, they actually can simulate that root water, for example, compensated root water uptake, which is one of the mechanisms that plant can deal with water stress. And we are still working on this part. So with this numerical modeling and data that she got from the observation, then she was able to come up with some results that show why some of these plants work better under limited irrigation. And albedo, they didn't really, Zara collected some data from her plots, but we are doing albedo this year with an undergrad researcher more systematically. So we're collecting, we retrofitted a stationary sensor that we can use it now as a handheld sensor. This is our new site, 8 species, and some of them are native and some not. So this is just preliminary, really preliminary data. I plotted them, I think 1 or 2 measurements of albedo over the summer. So this is we are gonna keep collecting data, and next year we're gonna collect data as well. Then I think we should have something to talk about albedo. But just looking at these data, I don't see a huge difference. I don't know how much difference should I expect to see, but all of them are around 20%. Maybe it's too early to see some differences, but it seems to me that albedo differences is not the main mechanism that drives that canopy temperature differences. It's mainly that isohydricity, and then the it's there. Some albedo differences are there, but root system. So excess of water and how much water they actually use for transpiration when they are under stress. I think that is the main mechanism. And another layer of research that is there, it's hard to see it here, but half of these plots are under drip irrigation, half under sprinkler irrigation. So this is our first also study that we are looking at drip. So Ali, now it's time for you to cover your ears. I know you are a fan of drip irrigation system. I'm just joking. So what we learned or I've seen is that it's hard to maintain. At least I'm not convinced that drip is going to be a good option for landscape irrigation. It's a constant battle between us and gophers and coyotes to keep this drip. Even if there is like 10-20% water saving, should be there, could be there. It's hard to maintain them. So for residential areas, I think they work. People just can look and see, but largely maintained public areas, drip irrigation, it's much harder than pop-up sprinkler heads. But we'll see, we'll have some results in terms of actual water saving. I told you that remote sensing is the future, and that's something that we do. I think we really need to have remote sensing products and data, science-based data that pushes, for example, drone-based applications for urban landscape irrigation or water management in general. So those NDVI thresholds that we developed that could be used directly for satellite data and drone data. Also, Zara and Jean-Claude did some interesting work that I'm going to talk about here briefly. Zara used drone to see if she can calculate actual ET. It's very important. Actually, how much water these plants uptake, and they are very diverse, as I mentioned, in terms of their behavior and also the plant palette that you get in reality in everywhere, I guess, parks, residential areas. There are so many different types of plants. So Zara used these two models that Sybil and simplified surface energy balance operational. She tweaked some of the settings to be able to use it for drones and then compare it against water balance that we measured using TDR sensors. And then you can see that the data, they're highly correlated and the results look promising. What Jean-Claude did, so his work was we realized that aesthetic values and temperature are as if it was not complicated enough for us. We also throw in carbon dynamics. So he did a lot of work on carbon. He published his first paper in ag water management that we reported carbon emission and aesthetic values and canopy temperature dynamics under deficit irrigation. But I'm not going to talk about carbon. First, it's complicated. Again, carbon dynamics is not just carbon emission, it's also sequestration and everything. So he's still crunching data for that part, carbon sequestration. But in terms of their own application, what he did, he said, okay, I'm going to develop some models to estimate carbon emission. And he wanted to go beyond just using raw drone data to develop machine learning models. It's basically, let's do physics-based machine learning. So he used this model TOTREM that is a physics-based model to estimate soil moisture. So the drone that has a thermal camera and a multispectral camera, then we use this model to estimate soil moisture. Then we feed soil moisture plus other, crop indices to estimate CO2 flux. These are just soil moisture maps that we estimate using TOTREM that work in general good. And these are results for lots of models. So some just use abiotic as inputs, vegetation indices and thermal band, abiotic vegetation indices and thermal band, 9 different models and how they perform. And then you can see the combined data. And he did his work on buffalo grass and Saint Augustine grass. Both of them are warm season species. Typically save more water than cool season species. You can see that some models perform poorly, some of them perform much better. So some of the take-home messages from his work, this is hopefully will be published soon in revision. So that if you use soil moisture as a predictor, which we cannot directly measure using drones. So you need to have a reliable model to go from drone to soil moisture and use it as a predictor. That's going to improve the performance of your models if you want to do carbon emission. And then we also realized that because we had actually measured soil moisture data using handheld sensors. We can just rely on this physics-based model TOTREM for CO2 flux modeling. So just go from raw drone data to soil moisture and then use that to estimate CO2 flux. This is our latest research that we just established a few months ago. Landscape mulching. Well, let me start over. The first phase actually started last year or maybe 2 years ago. That I was just running some laboratory experiments in small scale, different mulches, different depths. How does that impact evaporative loss? So you can see it here with these high props. And then second phase of the experiment was a bare soil experiment that we just got some funding from Metropolitan Water District of Southern California to do this. I think we have 12, no, we have 12 different mulch types, organic and inorganic. 10 mulch, one synthetic fake turf grass, and then bare soil. You're looking at soil moisture fluctuations. We have 48 soil moisture sensors installed to just see how these mulches, if there is a difference between them in terms of deep percolation and rainfall capture and evaporative loss. And then after that, we most likely are going to go to step 3 and put some plants there to see how plants actually perform, and then how does this impact their water need and growth. Okay, so since I have 5 more minutes left, I'm going to quickly talk about one more thing that we did. This is just to show you how a statistical modeling concept that was I picked was used by and modified by my students. So if you're involved in field trials, you know that there are always limitations in terms of how much of the weather variability you can capture. You do 2 to 3 years of data and collect data, and it's really difficult and time consuming. But then you may or may not get that very hot or very cold, those extreme weather conditions that you want to get. So that was the motivation when I first published this paper in Ag Water Management a couple of years ago. I said, okay, I'm going to do some modeling, very simple modeling, to be able to use those models to go beyond those years that I'm collecting data. And this is hybrid Bermuda grass. So if you're familiar with the concept of water production function in agriculture, that's basically if you plot irrigation application against yield, you get a function that you cut back water, yield goes down. For landscape, of course, we don't measure yield. So instead of yield, I put NDVI. And since it's not about production, I called it water response function. Then I realized that over time, as the season progresses, I see differences because plant uses the soil moisture that is already there in the soil profile, deplete that. Some of them can withstand some drought injury, but then the drought symptoms, which manifests itself as lower NDVI, is gonna show up. So I added another input, cumulative reference ET, so that shows evaporative demand, and then this is the result. And then I went back to CIMIS data. I said, okay, we have 40 years of worth of data. Which year was the year with highest evaporative demand? Which year with lowest evaporative demand? Let's plug those values in and see if the irrigation recommendations that we develop here, for example, let's say 75% ETO for Bermuda grass, is it enough if we have a super hot year? That was the motivation. Then Anish took the same concept. So, okay, if you did it for turf grass, we can do it for ground covers as well. So these are minimum NDVI thresholds, and these are water response functions. Again, irrigation application as input and cumulative ETO. Jean-Claude said, okay, if we can do it for previous weather conditions, why can't we use it for future? So what he did on top of all the carbon work, he said, I'm going to look at historical data. I'm also going to look at climate projections. And we have a very simple assumption here, and that is in the future, temperature that goes up translate to higher ETO demand. I know that this real story is much more complex, but that's our assumption. And then he used a tool that we developed in-house to talk about it earlier, to AI tool to estimate ETO for future climate projections, and then fed that to his water response function, and this is the result. And also he expanded it to canopy temperature. You see the fluctuation in temperature. This is already published in Ag Water Management. And one thing that he realized, for example, is that I think for buffalo grass, the minimum water application that works right now, it's not going to work in 50 years if these climate projections are true. And Zara, of course, she put her own spin on this. She said, okay, these are pure statistical models. I have process-based models. I'm gonna use process-based models. You don't have anything that tells us how much water is in the soil profile. I'm gonna get the outputs of my process-based models, use them as inputs for these water response functions, and that's this method two, actual transpiration, soil water content at 10 centimeter depths. And she realized that if you do that, it's going to yield better results in terms of canopy temperature. But for NDVI or overall health of the plants, our simple statistical model still works as well. And this is from one of our study sites. Never get tired of looking at this. I have other slides, but I think it's a good place to stop and answer and entertain some of the questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir, for your insightful presentation. A lot of great information you shared. Appreciate it. I think we have time for question. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask question. Tough question from Amir.
Top ones from Don. That is.
And John is here.
Yeah, I mean, plant-related questions, but I'm
I'm
joking.
here.
We would be happy to answer any question they might have.
So I'll chime in. I don't think, I didn't notice this until today, but on some of the data, you see that the ET, 80% ET irrigation, some of the plants, the temperatures were a little higher than it's say 60. And I think that's interesting and wondering that might be an overwatering thing with some plant species, that they are actually getting too much water. And so they're stressed from overwatering. That might be a good way to see um, how plants are stressed with too much water in some cases. But I think it's good to reiterate here that with landscape plants and a lot of these natives, there's Australian natives, there's still a lot of Southwestern natives that we haven't tried yet, that there's great opportunities to see how they are going to do. But with regards to landscapes, we have we have to keep in mind that landscapes are installed year round when developments are put into place, and we would like to install things in the spring, but that's not how the world works. So we have to work with the landscape industry, and they plant when they need to plant. And so a lot of these plants, they also have to have the tolerance for over irrigating at times because management is that way. It's not perfect. And so I like to find native plants that are not only drought tolerant, but also can put up with water when they aren't supposed to really have it, but will tolerate it. And I think a good example is creosote bush, Lauria tridentata, the desert plant. And that grows in washes, alkaline flats, and can take periodic flooding. So it's a plant that's, I think, underutilized and something we haven't tried yet. So it's something we need to consider. And then the other thing when we talk about this stuff is the actual drought tolerance and heat tolerance are two different things. And so we have to always point that out when we talk to different audiences because they are two different things. And we need to make sure that people understand that. So my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Don. For the canopy temperature thing, it's usually canopy temperature, if you are in the business of measuring canopy temperature, it's a tricky measurement because temperature fluctuates a lot. A little bit of breeze, although our protocol is to collect data in full sun, under full sun, which is brutal over the summer, close to solar noon, but still canopy temperature fluctuates. So for us, the way to normalize it is that we at the same time collect air temperature. So we always look at air minus canopy temperature. So in those slides, I should have mentioned that we use canopy temperature. Perhaps one simpler explanation is that air temperature was different when we were going over the plots. But overall, when we look at canopy minus air temperature in the entire data set, then the trend is what I explained. You're right, too much water might hurt the plants too, but you typically is that lower water application is gonna limit to transpiration, and that translate to higher canopy temperature values.
Amir, I have a question.
Sure.
So could you share your insight, what does the future of urban irrigation looks like in the next 10, 15 years in California? Do you see substantial changes are coming?
That's a great question. I see a push for turf grass replacement, non-functional turf. I think that's gonna happen. Some people think that it's hard to identify functional and non-functional turf grass. We actually are working with some CS folks on that. I think I would like to see personally more application of rain shut-off devices, smart controllers, and all of that, and yes, but maybe I should learn more. I don't know honestly on the policy side. I don't know how much we can actually inform the policy and what is gonna happen. I hope that it doesn't shrink. My fear is that two things actually. Sometimes I read articles, especially during drought, that people say, why should we even have plants? I mean, we can, if it's just aesthetic values, we can just have fake plants, or why do we need them? Then I think that's the part that we have been trying to promote, is that these plants, they have ecosystem benefits. You wipe the plants, then you'll see it in urban heat island effect, or the whole rainfall capturing using the plant species. So I think that's something that I've been trying to say. Another thing is that sometimes if people talk about water conservation, they need to realize that. So, for example, for trees, if you cut back water and don't think about that, trees usually are there, plants are there. So if you cut back water for turf grass, then maybe trees don't get water, and then at some point they're going to show symptoms of stress. So that's something that to also realize. I'm a little bit worried about also the messages that we send out in terms of how much water we can conserve, or tree health. That's my 2 cents. So
Thank you.
I think Edith has a
Yes, I did, yeah.
question.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. And great presentation, Amir. Really interesting stuff. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Um, I was curious to know if you or anyone you know has thought about how water conservation, and the effects on vegetation may impact this increasingly interesting area that we're all talking about, particularly in Southern California, around wildfire zones, and whether it's zone 0 or 1, thinking about how do we meet, the indication is better irrigated vegetation can potentially be a protector and not be as problematic, but of course that runs against conservation goals. So I'm just curious if you've given this any thought, or if you know anybody who's working in this space.
Yeah, I think no, this is an amazing question. I looked but right after LA fire, I think all of us started thinking about this. I didn't see much research in the literature, honestly. I think there is a need to do this. But then we should be very careful in terms of designing something that mimics the reality of a built environment. This would be way beyond my expertise. When flames actually travel and there is wind and everything, even if you have some wet vegetation around your house, maybe your house is going to catch fire, especially these older buildings. So maybe we need the sprinklers on top of the houses to keep everything wet. So that's something that definitely crossed my mind, but I'm not aware of anybody doing such work. So the only thing that we can do is to just burn these plants that we have, beautiful plants, at some point, to get at least some data to see if they can withstand heat or wildfire. But definitely, I'm intrigued by the whole concept of, okay, are we gonna plant selection, not only water conservation, what type of plant and trees we have, and whether those can fireproof us or help at least, with, of course, minimum water. So,
Yeah. Amir, hi, good seeing you.
hi,
Great
good to see you.
presentation.
Sam, thank you.
Also, something that I've seen is with succulents or agaves, at least in fires in Sonoma, Mendocino, that they were able to withstand fire. So also another one that we can think of it. Yeah, as you're saying, well, or Amir, very good question. I don't think anyone is working on this. Good seeing everyone.
Can you repeat the first part of your, I couldn't hear you. You said something works well for fire protection, but I couldn't hear the first part.
Sorry, Amir, no, it was just a comment. It was the comment of agaves and succulents as being
Okay.
fire resistant. Mhm.
Oh, yes, succulent, yes, yes. I think Don might know something. Yeah, I think plant selection might be important too.
So I know the environmental, I know Joanna Solons is on here and Bruno Pitton. I know at our work group meeting, program team meeting, they discussed these fires and they've been out there looking at the fires over in LA and looking at plant material. So there is discussion in the environmental horticulture group for that. So I don't know if Joanna wants to say anything or Bruno.
I have absolutely not been involved in that. I've been a party to the discussions, but I think what everyone said so far is true that we just don't have the data yet. But
So-
maybe Bruno knows more.
So we conducted an experiment in October, looking at the difference between drought stressed and well-watered plants in that zone 0. And in response to what would be like a burning shed, we conducted this at UC Berkeley with Michael Dolner. Yana was there. And then we had really excellent help from Berkeley and Richmond Fire. And what we found is that basically heat flux that is produced from a burning shed, which is pretty high, is, so great that there's not enough water in the plants to do anything. And so there's a little bit of that heat is attenuated by these well-watered plants, but eventually they dry out and catch on fire. And, if you do the calculations, you need something like, can't remember the exact number because I haven't done them recently, but it's like 10 liters per square meter of water. 10 liters of water per square meter of surface area to eliminate that heat to transfer to the building. So we're just in the infancy of this and have a lot to do.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, just so I am at UCLA, and I spent quite a lot of time in the burn zones, particularly in Palisades. And with ANR, we have this policy and research network on water supply and wildfire. And sometime probably in late summer, early fall, we will have a workshop on this question of these trade-offs between water conservation goals and wildfire protection goals. So if anyone is interested in that topic, by all means, please reach out, and I'll probably be reaching out to this group anyway. But it's good to know that I'm not the only one who hasn't found a lot on this just yet.
If I could, oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
I had a completely unrelated question. So I was curious because you say that you measured air temperature as well as the canopy temperature. And I was curious if you measured the air temperature like right over the plots, or if you did like different heights, and if you were able to find any impact of your plots on the air temperature.
Yeah, no, we right over the plots at waist height, usually 1.5, 1.2 meters. I'm convinced that you should have a big enough fetch to see a difference in air temperature. If it's a semester station, you're a soccer field right in the middle. When we do collect data, which is close to solar room, but then my personal experience in my house, if I water my backyard, I'm sitting in the shade, and then it's a little bit of breeze that contributes. So the whole heat comfort, I think, something that has multiple views. Are we talking about reduction in temperature at night or during the day? But I had the same question that you had. I said maybe right after we irrigate, maybe for a little bit of time, we have some differences. And to answer this question, of course, I instrumented some of these plots at different irrigation levels with stationary sensors, because the data that you see is handheld sensor. We go out, collect data, come back. Next week, we go out and collect data. So we have high resolution data from stationary sensors that we have canopy temperature. At the same time, we have air temperature at multiple depths, right above canopy and half a meter above canopy. I think that was the design. And then for I don't know how many months, but we literally didn't get a chance to even look at the data to see if there is any difference. So there might be an answer there that, okay, for a little bit of time right above the canopy, you see something. But my assumption was always that, okay, we don't have enough fetch, and then this cooling, in that context, we should look at the neighborhood or bigger area to see an impact on air temperature.
Well, thanks.
So I don't see any other question. I think we can close the webinar. Thanks you again, everyone, for joining us. And Amin, thank you again for the great
Thank you, Ali. Thanks for the opportunity. Good to see everybody.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir and Ali. Bye.